Hello and welcome back to Continuous Integration with Jenkins by Edureka. This is module 7 of this video series in which we are going to talk about distributed Jenkins configuration. The objectives of this module would be to first of all understand what exactly we mean by distributed Jenkins build, also known as Jenkins slave configuration. And we will configure master Jenkins node. We will configure the Jenkins slave node. We will talk about managing nodes and distributing jobs over the nodes. We will talk about binding jobs on the master and slave setup. And then finally, we will talk about labeling the nodes to run a specific job on a specific node. All right, so with that, let's get started. So where does this concept of distributed build comes into picture? So the main reason behind it is the scalability for Jenkins. Now, scalability is the ability of a system to expand its capabilities to handle the additional load. Now, we have seen so far that, we have a Jenkins master, Jenkins machine on which we are working. We are doing the configuration of the jobs on the same machine, and then we are actually working with the jobs, and our workloads are also running on the same machine. Now, what happens with this is that, there will be extra load. So it is fine if you have, let's say, 5 or 10 jobs running at the same time. However, it will create problems if you have more than 10 jobs you want to run simultaneously, which is pretty common if you have so many teams or if you have multiple projects supported by the same Jenkins master. So Jenkins basically supports this feature out of the box. The scaling of Jenkins, it depends on the master slaves model. So basically we have a master node, which is the main Jenkins instance. So far what we have been working with is actually known as the Jenkins master, on which you go ahead and install Jenkins and then configure all your jobs on which machine. Slaves would be separate nodes where agent instances will be running. These will be the nodes where you do not have any Jenkins installation. Jenkins master will connect to these machines and it will actually push the workloads on these machines, and then it will capture the output. So only the compute capacity or the memory usage, all these things will be used of the slave. All the configuration and management would still be done on the Jenkins master. Master will be basically responsible for distributing jobs across slaves. So as you can see, the picture, how it depicts is that before you have a single machine, Jenkins master, which is fine, it's doing our purpose, but it is not exactly very scalable, and it will create problems when you want to work with multiple jobs simultaneously. So the moment you put multiple slaves, your Jenkins server or the Jenkins infrastructure becomes much more powerful. And again, there is no specific limit. There is no hard limit on how many slaves you want to have or you can have. You can actually have any number of slaves. You can have 5, 10, 50, 100 slaves for a single Jenkins master, and that's absolutely okay. So let's take a look at what are the benefits of Jenkins scalability, or when we talk about distributed builds. So the first and the most important benefit is, of course, the parallel build capability. So as I have told you, if you have only Jenkins master, let's say you can run maybe 2, 3 or 4 jobs simultaneously. If you have, let's say, 5 Jenkins slaves, then if you run 4 jobs on each one of them, you can have probably 20 or more jobs running at the same time in parallel. So that's a huge achievement. That's quite a good scalability. And again, as I said, you can have not just 4 or 5 nodes. You can have 10, 20, 30 different slaves, and each one can then run the jobs in parallel. Step 2, or the second benefit, would be that you can easily replace corrupted instances. So let's say you have 5 slaves and out of which one is not working. So you can simply move out that slave and you can put a new one in place of this particular slave. And that is not going to affect your rest of the Jenkins configuration. It is not going to affect at all any other jobs which are working or which are running on any other slave machines. All these things can automatically be done by Jenkins. Load distribution, of course, as we have spoke about. So of course, we don't have any hard limit in terms of how many jobs you can run in parallel. However, having said that, you still have a limit in terms of resource capacity. So any Jenkins server, you can probably have maybe 8 gigs or 16 gigs or 32 gigs of memory, and then you can have maybe n number of compute capacity. However, there will always be a limit on a single machine. So if you want to have more loads working simultaneously, then it's a very good way to increase your scalability on Jenkins and having more jobs running in parallel. So distributing the load across different physical machines while keeping required resources available for each specific build plan. That's one of the major benefits of having Jenkins build slaves. Of course, it is cost effective as well because you have an option of adding and removing the slave instances on demand. So you don't have to keep the slaves running. You can actually add them on demand, and then once the job is over, you can capture the output, and then you can just go ahead and delete those build slaves. So all these things can be automated with the help of Jenkins. In fact, nowadays you have a capacity or the capability to have Docker containers as your build slaves. So what happens is you can initiate the Docker container creation process as part of your CI/CD build, and as part of the pipeline, it will actually spin up a container. It will run all the tests required on Jenkins, that container slave. Then you can capture the output, which will be done typically by the Jenkins master. And once the output is captured, and let's say if there is an artifact, you just save the artifact wherever you need it to be. And then you can safely go ahead and remove those Docker containers as well. You can simply bring them down if not in use. So that way you are able to save a lot in terms of resource capacity. Now, one thing is which is not mentioned here, which is also very important, that you can have different slave configurations based on your requirement. So for example, you can have, let's say at the same Jenkins master, you can have configurations for .NET based projects. You can have configuration for, let's say, Java and Maven based configuration. You can have Java plus Ant based combination. So for all of these, actually, as you would be aware, that you need to have different configuration on the slaves. And there is a high possibility that if you keep these configuration on the same machine, it might create conflict, it might create problem, and your machine might become unstable. It is a very good practice to create different slaves for different purposes. So you can have Maven based slaves, you can have .NET slaves, you can have Ant slaves for each of these requirements. And then again, you don't need to have only one single slave. For Maven, you can have, let's say, 4 or 5 or 10 different slaves, depending on your requirement. So this is achieved with the help of labeling, which we will see in later part of the same video. We'll talk about how exactly labeling is done, and then how then you map a specific job to specific labels or specific nodes that we are going to see. So what will happen is, let's say you have a Maven based jobs which you want to run only on Maven slaves. So you have an option of doing that with the help of labeling. Any kind of .NET jobs will go on to the machines where you have, let's say, IIS and MS build configured, which is required for .NET based projects. So all these things are possible with the help of distributed Jenkins build. And most of these things are actually out of the box. You just need to install the right plugin and just do a small configurations on the Jenkins master UI, and then we are good to go. All right, so let's take a look at what exactly distributed Jenkins build is. So as we have seen already, it basically helps you distribute the workload to the slaves. And as you can see on a screen now, so the top one is your Jenkins master, and you have 3 different Jenkins slaves as per the figure. So what happens is, to run heavy projects which gets built on a regular basis on a single machine is, of course, is not a good option. And as I told you, there is no hard limit as such on the number of jobs you can have, but there is always a resource constraint, and there is always a limit, a soft limit, which has to be implemented. So in such a scenario, you need to offload the load from the master by configuring more slaves. Now, the good part is that there is no hard limit in terms of number of nodes you can have as slaves. And distributed builds, they are used to absorb the extra load or to run specialized build jobs in specific operating systems or environments. So this is what I meant when I said you can have different jobs with Maven or Ant or .NET or any other platform for that matter. You can even have Python based builds, or you can have Ruby based builds. So all these specific languages or specific platforms, you can have different slaves configured for. Now, Jenkins slaves are generally required to provide the desired environment, so they work on the basis of requests received from Jenkins master. So how does the architecture looks like? Primarily, it's a master-slave architecture, as we have spoken, and master and slave, they communicate through TCP/IP protocol. Master represents main Jenkins server, and it handles all the tasks for the build system. So basically, Jenkins master is your machine, or is the UI from where everything is being controlled. So some of the things which Jenkins master does is scheduling the build jobs, dispatching builds to the slaves for the actual execution, monitoring of the slaves, recording and presenting the build results, and it may also execute build jobs directly if needed. But in most of the cases, when you have slaves, you typically don't want to put the workload on the Jenkins master. You want to keep it free only for UI purposes. Because what happens if the load is extra on the Jenkins master, and if, let's say, it goes slow, then it might hit or it might affect the UI as well. It will take more time to load, and if you are saving something, if you're changing something, it might take a little longer to respond. It might hang as well, so which typically happens for any application which has got a resource crunch. So in order to avoid that, the best practice is to keep Jenkins master free only for the management purpose, and have slaves for respective workloads to be offloaded on those machines. So slave, Slave is basically a remote machine that is set up to offload build projects from the master, and it listens for requests from the Jenkins master. Each slave runs a slave agent. Now we have different ways of configuring a slave. We will take a look at some of them at least. And a full Jenkins installation on a slave is not required. You just need to have that agent configured. So basically you initiate a machine as Jenkins slave. That's the bare minimum configuration you need. And of course there are various ways to start slave agents, but there should be a bi-directional communication between the slave agent and Jenkins master in order to operate. So you need both ways communication. Most of the times it happens through SSH. So we have SSH as one of the mediums to be communicated. Apart from that, we have jar file based communication as well based on JNLP. So we'll see that when we talk about the ways to connect a Jenkins slave to the master. So what Jenkins does is the slave, basically it takes requests from master instance. It can run on various operating systems. You can have any kind of operating system as your Jenkins build slaves, and it will execute the build jobs which have been dispatched by the master and where you have the node mentioned as the node label where it is matching. So if there is no label, if there is no specific needs as mentioned, then in those cases, Jenkins will allot or allocate the jobs in a round robin fashion to all the slaves which are available. So this is one of the figures which will explain nicely. So once there's a code commit triggers continuous integration. So from there, it will go to the Jenkins master first, and then Jenkins master in turn, based on how you have configured the job, it will give the job to any of the specific slaves. It can be Windows, Linux, Mac, as we have seen. And then finally, it will send the test report, which will again be captured by the Jenkins master. So the whole idea of having a slave machine or Jenkins slave is to offload the actual work or the workload of the Jenkins master. And that's the only purpose which you need to have. And as I said, to segregate the environment so you can have different platforms configured on different slaves. So how do we do that? So again, that's not exactly very complicated. It's pretty simple actually. So the Jenkins master, it comes with the basic installation of Jenkins. And in this configuration, the master handles all the tasks for the build system. So this we have seen already. Whenever we work with a Jenkins master, basically we worked on a single Jenkins machine. So whatever builds are happening, whatever jobs are running, they are running on the master itself. It's not mandatory to have Jenkins clients. Again, as we have spoken, we have worked so far with only Jenkins master. Jenkins slave is not a compulsory thing, but you do it as a best practice. You keep it in your environment, especially if you have a big Jenkins environment managed by a single master. For small projects, as we spoke, Master Jenkins can also create the build, and by default, a master node will be running. So you need to have a master node which will be running. You can actually offload the complete load as we have spoken initially, but you can definitely set up the build jobs on the same machine as well. That's also absolutely fine. So configuring slave machine, again, it's not exactly very difficult. You go to Manage Jenkins, and within Manage Jenkins, you click on Manage Nodes. There's a section, and this is the screen which you will be greeted with. So you need to give a node name. That name you can put anything. Then you select this thing called permanent agent. So basically this is the default mechanism. So any node is a permanent agent in case of Jenkins. This has come recently because you also have an option of, as we have spoken, as part of the CI/CD pipeline, you also have an option of dynamically provisioning nodes or dynamically provisioning build slaves for Jenkins. And if the job is done, or once the job is done, you can go ahead and delete those nodes. The best example is using Docker containers as your build slaves. However, in case of when we are adding one node manually, in those cases, we call them as permanent agents. The second option which you see on a screen, which is this copy existing nodes, this option will come only once you have one node configured as slave. And you have an option of copying all the configuration from that node to the new node which you are creating. When you are adding a slave for the first time, this option will not be there. You will have option only of this permanent agent. So now the ways to configure the Jenkins slave. So you have multiple ways. So you can actually launch slave agents via SSH, which is again one of the most common ways. This we will take a look at definitely. We can configure launch slave agents via Java Web Start. So this is something very commonly used if you have a Windows machine to be run as a slave, because as you know, SSH will not work on Windows. I mean, of course, you can make it run, but that's not the default behavior of Windows machines. And you can also let Jenkins control the Windows slave as a Windows service. So you can actually configure Jenkins as a Windows service, and it will run in the background, and it will be initiated by Jenkins as and when needed. And also you have an option of running launch agent by executing a command on the master. You can run some scripts You can save some scripts, you can do some pre-configuration, and then whenever you want those nodes to be connected to the master, you just need to run this command on the master and it will call the agent and it will configure the agent and it will put the load on those agents. The only precondition is if it is a virtual machine, it has to be up and running. You can't call a slave which has not been created or which has been shut down. The machine, if it is not up and running, you can't use this option called launch agent by executing a command on the master. This is the screen which is most commonly being used when you click on configure a new slave. This is the page you are greeted with. So as you can see, we do have a number of options on this page. So let's go through with all the parameters in the node configuration page as displayed on the screen now, and let's understand what exactly these are. So the first is name, which is kind of self-explanatory. So it is the name of the slave, which should be unique, of course. You can't have the same name for two different slaves. The second one is description, which is again optional. You can use this to define or mention what kind of slave is this. So let's say, for example, if you have different platforms, you can mention this is a Maven build slave, or this is a, let's say, .NET build slave. You can mention like that. Or let's say if it is a slave for a particular department or a particular project, you can definitely mention this. So again, since it is optional, you can actually ignore this as well, but it would be really helpful for other team members if you mention this description and put just a small introduction what exactly this slave is being used for. Now, number of executors, that hash of executors is basically the number of executors. It basically shows that the maximum number of concurrent builds that Jenkins may perform on this agent. So on screen, if you see, it has got just one executor. So that would mean that you can have only one job running at one particular time on this node which you're going to configure. But you definitely can have more than one. You can keep 2, 3, 4, 5, up to you. Now, as a general practice, what you do is that if this particular slave is not very good in terms of capacity, so basically I mean by RAM and CPU and hard disk, of course. So hard disk is something which is not very crucial in nowadays, but RAM and CPU are the two major things which you consider when you talk about resources. So if it is low on resources, then I would suggest you keep it as only 1 or 2 executors at max. However, if you have a strong machine, if you have a powerful machine which has got really good amount of RAM and CPU and hard disk, then you can go up to, let's say, 3, 4, 5 as well in terms of number of executors. Next is the remote root directory. So basically an agent needs to have a directory dedicated to Jenkins. So you specify the path to this directory on the agent, and it's always a best practice to use an absolute path, such as, let's say, /var/Jenkins/node, or maybe if it is on Windows, so c/Jenkins/node1. Any path is fine. It's up to you. You can even put /temp and then / let's say Jenkins workspace. So this is the folder, or this is the directory where actually your workspace for Jenkins will be created, right? And it is a mandatory field. You have to put some value over here. Now labels, these are basically tags, and they're used to group multiple agents into one logical group. What do I mean by that? Let's say you want to create 4 or 5. You have a lot of Maven based projects, okay? And you want to have multiple Maven slaves. You need to give unique name in the first section. But in this section, labels, you can have 5 different machines having the same label. That way, Jenkins will know that, these are the machines which have the same configuration. And then within those machines, then it can be configured as, in a round robin fashion. So, and Jenkins will understand how many nodes are there for each label. So for example, if I want to run, let's say, Maven based builds, so I can give the label as Maven slave, and I can have a Maven slave as the label for maybe 4 or 5 different machines. So any Maven job will come to only those machines, and then within those machines, it will be distributed in a round robin fashion. Another example would be, so let's say you can put as Linux Docker. So it would assign 2 different labels to the agent, Linux and Docker. So, and then whatever Linux based load or Docker based load would be coming, it would come to those machines only. Usage basically tells Jenkins how Jenkins schedules build on this node. So if you see on a screen, you have this option mentioned as use this node as much as possible. So as this suggests, it will be used to the maximum capacity. This is basically the default setting. So in this mode, Jenkins will basically use this node freely. There will not be any kind of restriction on Jenkins and any other such parameters. Launch method. So launch method is very important. So basically it controls how Jenkins starts the agent. So again, you have multiple options here. So again, when we see the demo, we will talk about each of the options. But first option which you see on a screen is actually tells you that launch slave agents via SSH. Now this is the most common methodology when you are working with Linux slaves, because Linux works on SSH. You just need to give the host name, and there should be a way to connect to those. Jenkins master should be able to SSH to the Linux node, and then Jenkins will take care of the rest. Then of course in the next section you have to give the host name. So either the name or the IP address you can give. Name you can give only if it is DNS resolvable. If it is not, then it's always a best practice to give the IP address of the machine which you are configuring as a slave. Then you need to add the credentials as well. So this will be the credentials which Jenkins will use to SSH to that node. Next is host key verification strategy. So again, you have multiple ways of doing it. So you can actually choose the option that known host file verification strategy. But in this case, you need to make sure that from Jenkins master, you have SSH'd at least once to the Jenkins slave. Because if you would not have done that, then it will be stuck at the first screen where it asks for you to type yes, that okay, should the Linux machine add this slave as a known host, right? So for that purpose, so that is the reason, as a best practice, when you configure this, just go to your Jenkins master and SSH into the Jenkins slave. That way that message will be overwritten and it will not come again. Otherwise, in the dropdown you have an option of not using any kind of verification strategy. So that works fine as well. That's about the options. So let's take a look at all the major ways how actually you connect. So launch methods, these are the launch methods through which Jenkins will start the agent on the slave machines. So the first option, as we have spoken, launching a slave agent via SSH. So this is the most common used in a Linux based environment. So it starts a slave by sending commands over a SSH connection. So slave should be reachable from the master, and you need to provide an account that can log into the target machine as well. And in fact, as a best practice, what we do is we make sure that Jenkins master is able to do a passwordless authentication to the Jenkins slave. And in a Unix environment, the most convenient way to start a Jenkins slave is to use SSH. So not only Unix and Linux both, SSH is the most preferred way, unless you have a specific reason to do otherwise. So the second option, launch agent via Java Web Start. It will actually, you need to click on the agent.jar. It will save the file, and you have to push this file on the Jenkins slave as well. So basically it allows slave to be launched using Java Web Start. In this case, a JNLP file must be opened on the agent machine, which will establish a TCP connection to the Jenkins master. Now this would mean that the agent need not be reachable from the master. The agent just needs to be able to reach the master. If you have enabled, let's say, security via that global security page, so configure global security option under manage Jenkins, then you can customize the port on which the Jenkins master will listen for incoming JNLP agent connections. So by default, this agent actually is launched via GUI. As you can see here, you need to click on launch, and if the agent is headless, you can actually use this command as well. If you see at the bottom, you have this option of using JNLP, this full command. You just need to make sure that you are running it from the same folder where you have agent.jar file saved. That's all you need to do. The next option is to manage Windows Slave as a Windows service. So as we have spoken, this starts a Windows Slave by a remote management facility. So this is basically WinRM in Windows, where you can do a remoting on a Windows machine from outside. You don't need to do an RDP. It's like a counterpart for SSH on Windows machines. In fact, if you are working with PowerShell, you use it very often, WinRM capability. So you can manage Windows slaves by using this option, and the only condition is that the slaves have to be reachable from the master via the IP. The master should be able to ping and do the remote in, so WinRM should be available for these kind of communications. Typically, you use 5985 as the port to be used in case of WinRM if you're using it. And the last option is the launch agent. So basically, you manually launch the agent, or you run this command every time when you start the agent. So basically it starts a slave by executing a command from the master machine, and as a command you mention which jar file to be chosen and which jar file to be executed. So that takes care of the starting of the agent on the remote machine. You basically use this when the master is capable of remotely executing a process on another machine. It can be SSH or RSH as well. So remote shell or secure shell is the options which you use. Alright, so when you configure the Jenkins slave, as we have spoken, the name is a unique way of identifying your slave machine. So it can be anything, but you need to make sure that it is something meaningful so that you understand which machine you are trying to connect to. And again, you add description to make other human beings to be understandable. So basically it's helpful for your teammates when they are checking this thing, when they are on the UI and trying to understand the purpose of this node. This description should help them. Number of executors, as we have spoken, so it basically defines how many concurrent build jobs that this node can execute. So, and this is something which is configurable, and as a best practice, as I told you, if it is a machine with small capacity, not very heavy resources, you keep it as 1 or 2 maximum. If you see that your machine is quite powerful, let's say 16 gigs or 32 gigs of memory and having, let's say, 8 vCPUs and all, then of course you can have more number of jobs or more number of executors. So this is the maximum limit of simultaneous jobs running on that machine. So Jenkins, of course, it needs to know where it can find the build tool. So for example, so the build tool examples could be JDK, Maven, and Gradle, etc. So if the build tools are configured to be automatically installed, then no extra configuration has to be done for the slave machines. Jenkins will download and install the tools as required. However, if the build tools are installed locally on the slave machine, we need to provide Jenkins where it can find them. So you do this by selecting the tool locations checkbox and providing the local paths for each of the tools you will need for your build jobs. Now this is important to understand because especially when you have multiple nodes serving the same label name. So let's say if you have 4 machines for Maven build jobs, you need to make sure that the tool location or the build tool locations for, let's say, Maven or Ant or Gradle is exactly the same on all the machines. So let's say if it is /var/lib/maven, it has to be the same exact path on all those 4 machines. Otherwise it will create conflict. So you need to be very careful with that part. Managing nodes, again, it's not exactly very difficult. Most of the things out of the box when you work with Jenkins, the slave machines are actively monitored by Jenkins, and most of the things, and as a summary, you do see when you see the home page for manage nodes. And if Jenkins considers that the node is incapable of safely performing a build, it will simply take the node offline. You don't need to worry about that. Then you can, check out the machine. You can maybe do a SSH and see what exactly is the problem, then fix it, and then you just make it online again. And then Jenkins will start dispatching the workload to that machine or to that node. And under the manage nodes screen, we can see what exactly Jenkins monitors. And if any of these criteria is not met, Jenkins will automatically take the server offline. So how does Jenkins monitor the slave? Jenkins monitors the slave agent in different ways. So it monitors the response time. So a slow response time can indicate either the slave machine is down or there is a network problem. So if any one of them occurs, and if master sees that the response time is high or maybe higher than the actual threshold, it will bring the machine offline. It will label the machine simply as offline. It monitors the amount of space taken up by the build job. So disk space, temporary directory, swap space, all these things will be checked. And very minute thing, but very important, it checks the system clock. So far as I remember, you cannot have a clock from the Jenkins master. Jenkins slave clock cannot drift more than, I think, 2 minutes or 3 minutes. If it is more than that, then it will simply tell that you need to fix the clock timings. So you need to make sure that Jenkins master and Jenkins slave have the exact same timings. If there is a time drift, then it will, again bring the node offline. This is how the list looks like when you work with Jenkins, manage Jenkins, and click on manage nodes. This will show you, of course, there'll be one master node, which is the Jenkins master. And then you will have 2 different, whatever number of slaves you have, that will be shown. And as you can see here, it will show the name of the slave, the architecture on which machine it has been built. It will show the clock difference. So in sync would mean that everything is good and there is no drift more than 2 minutes. I think 2 minutes is the maximum limit which you can have. Then of course it will show the free disk space as well for each one of them, free swap space, free temporary space, and the response time. So as long as the response time is within milliseconds, it is fine. If it is a couple of seconds, if it is more, then of course there is a problem and Jenkins will bring the server offline. So you can actually mention the threshold limits as well by preventing node monitoring option. You can mention what kind of space threshold you want, what kind of swap space you want, and whether you want these to be monitored or not. That can also be controlled. So if you just remove the check marks, then these things will not be considered. But that's not a good idea because all those 3-4 things which we have seen in the previous screen, these are very important. So you would like to monitor the clock difference, the free space, and the response time. These are the mandatory things you should have. Because if you don't monitor this, and if there is a high chances of that Jenkins will not know if there is an issue with any of these things, and it might affect your actual build. So it's always a good idea to monitor some of these basic parameters by Jenkins. Labeling. So as we have spoken, labeling the nodes is actually, it's a way of kind of grouping multiple nodes in a single umbrella. So in real life scenarios, we might want a node to be reserved for certain kind of jobs. And as I said, the best example is like if you have different platforms or let's say different build tools. So in those situations, so for example, if you have jobs that run performance tests, So let's say if you have jobs which works for compiling, if let's say you have jobs for only for deployment, so those kind of things which you want to have different nodes configured, and you may want them to only run on a specially configured machine while preventing all other jobs from using that machine. So to do so, you would restrict where the test jobs may be running by giving them a label expression matching that machine. And then if you see when you are creating a job, this is one of the options when you say you can actually, while configuring the node, you can use this option. If you remember, there was one option called use this node as much as possible. So instead of that option, you can use this option called only build job with label expressions matching this node. So we'll talk about this in just a bit. We'll see a live demo to understand what exactly it means. So labels are actually a very useful concept when you distribute build architecture and when it becomes big in size. So you can define labels or tags to each build node and then configure a build job to run only on a slave node with a particular label. So this way you control, you do a slave to job mapping kind of thing. So only those specific jobs will go to those specific slaves. But that kind of mapping can be controlled and managed through Jenkins labels or the slave labels. Usage field basically allows to configure how intensively Jenkins will use this slave. So there are three options available. So first one we have seen already, utilize this slave as much as possible, leave this machine for tied jobs only, and the third option is take this slave online when in demand and offline when idle. So typically the third option would be the most useful because this way you will be able to control the nodes. But again, it depends on your requirement. You can have any one of these. This is how you basically do the mapping. Once you have configured the node, when you are creating the job, you can choose this option called restrict where this project can be run, and then give the label of the node, not the name of the node. Be careful with that. So with the help of label, you can control that this job will go to only those slave machines and not anywhere else, not even on master. Now, some of the important points to remember when you are labeling the nodes, that the simplest use of label expression is to determine where a build job can or cannot be executed. If your web test requires Internet Explorer, for example, you will need them to run on a Windows machine. So you could express this by simply quoting the corresponding label, which may be, let's say, Windows or maybe testing or maybe UI testing. So whatever label you have mentioned, you just need to make sure that the same label you are calling here when you are configuring the job. Let's say if you want to run tests against Firefox, but only on Linux machines. So you could exclude Windows machines from the range of candidate build nodes by using the negation operator. So exclamation Windows would mean that you don't want to run this on Windows machines, anything else but Windows. That's what it means. And then you can do the multiple combinations of AND operators and exclamation marks, all these things to set up how exactly you want them to be working for you. Enough of theory, so let's take a look at how exactly we work with distributed Jenkins build. So this is my Jenkins master, which we have been using so far for our demos. I have these machines as well up and running. So this is the machine which I'm using using as Jenkins master. As you can see, this IP address ending with 145 corresponds to the IP address on the address bar here, ending with 145:8080 is the port number. As you know, Jenkins works by default, listens by default on port 8080. So once that is done, what I have done is, apart from this machine, I have created two more machines having IP addresses like this. So this is ending with 146 and this IP address has got ending with 147. So these are the two machines which I intend to use as build slaves. So I'm on my Jenkins master. I need to go to manage Jenkins page, and from there I need to scroll down a little bit and click on manage nodes. So as you can see here, Saturn I have already added as my build node, and I've given this name as Maven as the label. So what we'll do is, and if you want to make any changes, you can just go to this configure page. This is how it looks like, and you can actually make any changes. So let's say I want to, number of executors I want to increase from 1 to 2. You can actually do that. Click on save, and if you just notice on your left hand side, build executor, as of now it is showing only 1 as idle. The moment I click on save, now it will show as 2 as idle. And if I go to the Jenkins main page, if you see here, I have master having 2 idle executors and Saturn, which is my first build slave, as 2 idle executors. So master and slave combined, I can have 4 different jobs running simultaneously on my Jenkins infrastructure. Alright, so let's go to manage Jenkins again. and go to manage nodes. Now let's say I want to set up a new machine, a new node I want to add here. So again, the process is simple. Click on new node. I'll give the name of the host to identify, which is Mars in this case, of course, because Jupyter is my Jenkins master. So Mars I want to add as a Jenkins slave. So I'll give the name same as this one so that it is easy to identify. Of course, I want this to be a permanent agent. I'll not use this option because I want to show everything to you. Otherwise, the easiest way would be to just copy existing node, and I can give the copy from Saturn as the name. So it will take all the configuration and it will create a same slave as Saturn. But let's go here, permanent agent, click on OK. Now, as you can see here, it is giving me all these options which we have discussed. So name is fine, and it has to be unique. That's the only criteria. And for our understanding, it has to be something which is identifiable, which is easy to understand that which node I'm referring to. So by default, I keep my name as the host name of the node. That way I know which node is I'm talking about. Description again, let's put something like, so that should be good enough. Again, let's keep as 2 executors. I can actually keep 1, 2, 3, 4 also. Let's keep it 4 just for demo purpose. Anyways, we are not running multiple jobs, so that should not affect anything. Remote root directory, as we have spoken, you should give something. So you can typically give home folder, or in my case, let's keep it as temp folder. So what it will do is it will go ahead and create the workspace of Jenkins inside the temp folder. This is important, labels. So as you remember, Saturn I have labeled as Maven. So let's do this one as well. Let's select as Maven itself so that it will be clubbed along with Saturn, right? So, and basically I'm using it for any kind of Maven jobs. So we'll take a look at that. And as you can see here, the moment if I click on usage, I have 2 options. So the first option says use this node as much as possible. And the second one says only build jobs with label expression matching this node. So I believe in the first, when I was configuring Saturn, I have chosen the first option. So in this case, let's choose the second option. So this would mean that Jenkins will not use this node unless we have mentioned in the job that I want to use a slave which has got a label called Maven. Then we have again multiple options. As you remember, we have multiple options to start the agent. We will stick to the first option which says launch agent via SSH. Of course, now I have to provide the host name or the IP address. So in my case, the IP address is this. Or I believe it's 146. Let's just do a cross check. Yeah, it is 146. And now in this case, actually, I already have the credentials added here. I have a Vagrant user on my slave machine. So I have just added it here, ID and the password. If it is not there, when you are doing it for the first time, you just need to click on this add, click on Jenkins and add the ID and the password. Not only this, you can actually define if let's say you have passwordless authentication. So you can just choose this username, SSH username with private key option, and then you can just provide the key. So if you select this option, username with private key, it will ask for the username. You can give, let's say, Vagrant, and private key, you have multiple options. So if you click on this entire enter directly, you can put the whole key here. You can copy it from your other nodes and you can put it over here. But that's not required. I have already added the user ID and the password. I just need to select that option. So if I do this, looks good. Again, if there is any issue, if Jenkins is not able to connect, it will throw an error message over here. So if you remember, when I chose this option, no, looks like so I have this user over there. So I just stick to Vagrant, which is my user, which is available on all the nodes. So that's the safest way for me. Again, when you click on this host key verification strategy, you have 4 options. You can either do manually provide key, manually trust the key, known host file verification strategy. I would do, the most common is to known host file verification strategy, but in this case, you need to make sure that you have logged in at least once using SSH from your master to the node which you are configuring. Otherwise, it will be stuck on the first screen. If you remember, in Linux, whenever you do SSH for the first time to any of the other hosts, it asks you that whether it can add this to the known host files or not. So that is something which you need to take care. In my case, I'll go safe and I'll just choose this non-verifying verification strategy. Since it is lab environment, it is fine. The last option is the availability part. So as we have spoken, so you have 3 options. Keep this agent online as much as possible. Take this agent online according to a schedule. So you can mention that, every day between 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. you want this to be available, or every time, if you select this option, actually, it will give you that same cron tab entry details. So you can mention for how long you want this to be on, as you can see here. So in our case, we don't want this. What we need is we want this to be available on all the time. So as long as the node is up and running, it should be available to Jenkins. That's what I mean here when I say this option. All right, so all looks good. If I click on save, so as of now it is showing as cross. If I come over here and if I click on log, it will actually show me all the details, how it has run. So it has actually done the SSH to the machine, authentication successful, remote user environment is, and all the environment variables it is defining to me or kind of throwing out to me. And if you see the last couple of lines, it mentions that this is a Unix agent, evacuated std out, agent successfully connected and online. So now if I go back to the list, as you can see that red cross has been removed from ours. And as you can see, I have got 4 idle executors, which I have of course configured for Mars to be there. So as you can see, I have 2 different build slaves configured. Both of them have been labeled as Maven, and they are up and running. I can use them whenever I want. So now let's take a look, how do we use them in our jobs? So for that, I need to go back to Jenkins dashboard. Let's go to Maven project. Let's see what we have got here. Let's click on configure. So I have my test dev configured, and this is the repository which we have been using so far. So if you see here, I have this one. This is on my GitHub repository. This is the one I'm using, which has got a couple of test files and one pom.xml file, which basically, it's more like a dummy file, but it has got the information about, this will basically initiate the Maven project. So I go there and compile and test. So that looks okay. Post build action not required. No notification is needed. If I just select this option, actually, let's run it first time. Let's see what happens. So as of now, it is random. So it might go to a slave or it might run on the master itself. Let's see what happens. If I click on build now, as you can see here, it has been taken by the master itself. This shows that it is build number 9. And if I want, I can actually go to the console output. It will tell me that it's building on master and all these things. So rest all is expected. If I go back to project, in fact, let's go back to Jenkins main page. Let's run it once again. So as I've told, this is random at the moment, so it can go anywhere. Basically, it will go to the default one. So master is basically the default one at the moment. So it will go to master only. Now let's do one thing. Let's go to this job again and go to configure. And let's choose this option, restrict where this project can be run. And let's provide a label. The moment you type M, it will give you the options. So let's say I click on Mars, but this one is not the name of the label. This is the name of the agent, which again, it will not take. So instead of that, if I click on M again, if I choose Maven, as you can see here, now Jenkins is smart enough to tell me that label Maven is serviced by 2 nodes. So if you remember, we have given the same label for both Saturn and Mars. And if I click on this link, let's see what does it show me. So it comes to the node page, and if you see on the address bar, it shows label and Maven, and it shows that this label is served by Mars as well as Saturn. So I can go ahead and check out these ones. Not needed, so I can go back to my main page and that's all is needed. If I go ahead and click on save, and this time if I come back to the home page and if I click on build now, as you can see, this time it is running on Mars and not on Saturn, not on master. So since Mars and Saturn are the labels which are running, which are matching for this node, for this label, so it will be taken round robin on any one of them. Basically whichever is free. It's kind of random. So let it complete and then we will proceed. So since it is running on the first time on Mars, so it is going to take some time. In fact, if I go to this project and if I go to the console output, it will show me what is going on at the moment. So as you can see here, since on Mars, JDK and Maven are not installed. So what will happen is, since, and as I have mentioned, these to be installed by Jenkins, I don't want to install myself. So if you remember, we had 2 options. We either have to install it manually, all the build tools, or we can just put a check mark on Jenkins master that, whenever it is going to be used, Jenkins will do the installation on our behalf. So since it is the first time, it is going to take some time, and it will install JDK, it will install and configure Maven as well. And once everything is done, okay, so looks like it is done. So it is cloning the remote repository now. That was complete. And now it is going ahead with the Maven configuration as well. So once that is done, it will start with Maven compile and Maven test as well. And again, since it is the first time, it is going to take a little while here. So now if I come back to the main page here, so as you can see here, it is Mars. So now let's say if I bring Mars offline, so I always have an option of doing that. So let's say go to Manage Jenkins. If I go to Manage Nodes, and if I just click disconnect, as of now, I don't want to do that because it is up and running. So next time when I run the job, since Mars is no longer available and master is not labeled as Maven, it will go to Saturn, because Saturn is the one which is serving that label called Maven. All right, so that's how you configure the jobs, and that's how you kind of select the build nodes to be, or the build slaves to run the job. So let's see what have we got here. So this is what we have seen, how to configure the slave and how to slave the agent, how to choose all these options, the name, description, number of executors, remote root directory, labels, etc., etc. Once it is complete, this is how it looks like. And then you can use this, restrict where this project can be run. So, and then you can give the name of the label. So as you can see here, as per the screenshot, tester is serviced by 4 nodes. In our case, Maven was serviced by 2 nodes. So since we have 4 nodes by the label tester, it is showing as we have 4 nodes available. Then whatever steps you have to perform, you can just put all those things there. You don't need to have any difference. You don't feel any difference. It's all the same. So only difference would be when you start the thing, it will show that building remotely on slave 1. In fact, let's just check whether it is showing on our case as well or not. So if I go to the console output, since it is first time, as I said, it is still running. And if I go to the console output, so the compile is going on at the moment. And if I go right at the top, if you see here, it tells me that building remotely on Mars. And in bracket, it shows the label which is being used here. And one more thing, if you remember, I gave /temp as my root directory. So within /temp, Jenkins has created a directory called workspace, and then it is using maven-project, which is the name of the project, as the root directory or as the working directory for this project. In fact, if I want, I can actually check on that machine as well. So if I go to Mars, if I go to /temp, so as you can see, I have a directory called workspace. If I go inside workspace, I have a Maven project. And if I do go here, as you can see here, the source code for my test-dev project has been downloaded here. So this first step, what Jenkins does is it clones the source code inside the workspace, which has been done already. All right, so that completes this module and about the Jenkins slave nodes. What we have learned in this module, we spoke about the overall, what do we mean by distributed Jenkins build, also known as Jenkins build slaves configuration. We spoke about how to configure master. We spoke about how to configure slave. Then we spoke about how to manage the nodes and distribute the jobs over the different nodes. Then we spoke about binding of jobs on the master and slave setup and mapping specific jobs to specific slaves with the help of labels, and then how to label the nodes to run a specific job on them. All right, so that's it for this video, and thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.